The Hurley by Paul Mendez. Read by David Harewood.
Josiah and Doris, both in their 20s and dressed in black cotton basics, had just finished work. It was almost midnight on a Tuesday in early September, and they were sitting on stools on the pavement outside their restaurant, smoking cigarettes and drinking tumblers of house red wine. Another waiter and two bartenders were finishing off last bits inside, closing down the glass washer and counting out the cash tips while dancing to Kalela's Rewind. The duty manager could be seen through the window, popping his head up from the office to ask them to turn it down a little, after recent complaints by local residents about the thumping bass during close-downs. Doris, tiny from Barcelona, usually enjoyed a spliff after work, but had run out of weed and was busy texting around to find some when a beggar approached, and in a soft voice stooped to ask if either she or Josiah had any change. They shook their heads and apologized, with tired half smiles, as they put their phones in their pockets. Homeless people were a common sight on Hackney Road, and it was the restaurant's policy never to give them anything, just in case they got used to the charity and couldn't be gotten rid of. "In all honesty, I'm skint," said Josiah, still living with his mother, a nurse, in his childhood flat on the former Murder Mile. Unlike almost all their neighbours from that community and time, families splintered by crime, innocent young deaths, a predatory housing market, gentrification, and, on a positive note, vastly different opportunities for successive generations. "Here," said Doris, when the beggar asked for the end of her cigarette. And once he took it from her, she rolled her eyes and wiped her fingers on her trousers. Josiah had almost a full 20-pack in his pocket, but as a deterrent to the beggar, he crushed his end to nothing beneath his foot. The beggar started muttering his story to them, intoning nasally rather than shaping his mouth around actual words, tucking his chin in, even as if to avoid imposing his breath on them. He wore his white stubble fine, and a beanie low over his brow. There was a style to him. Josiah drifted away to notice his coats were grey and elegantly, almost fashionably cut, and there was no odour to him at all. Perhaps he was some sort of provocateur or activist, rather than someone who had genuinely fallen on hard times. A delinquent through choice, like the Tokyoites, who sleep in blue tents in rejection of capitalism. Doris and Josiah humoured him by nodding where it seemed opportune, or when they recognized a word like bank, or council, or arsehole. More interestingly, over the beggar's shoulder, Josiah saw a middle-aged white man walking up the road towards them, waving a sporting stick in both fists. He didn't look threatening, as Josiah could immediately see from the shape of his glasses that he was well-to-do and probably wore crisp white shirts for his day job, though right now he was dressed in khaki shorts, a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles t-shirt, and flip-flops. He seemed more likely to be returning home from a casual dinner and a pint at the Marksman than from a game of whatever the stick he was carrying was supposed to be for. Even when he raised it and brought it down so that its contact surface came to rest between Josiah and the beggar at head height, positioned his feet hip-width apart, and wiggled his bum as if he was about to take a golf swing, Josiah saw no reason for alarm. Surely it was just a fun, rich white man, graciously stooping down to involve the street kids in his tipsy reverie. "Do not talk to this man," the white man said, theatrically, in an American accent. The beggar escaped on tiptoe like a Scooby-Doo character, disappearing up a side street. Coming round to face Josiah and Doris, the American man's fists gripped the long, polished, painted handle tightly. It looked too precious, this stick, to be risked on actual sporting activity. Gucci flip-flops, Josiah saw. "He's been living on my street," the American said, breathing shovels of air. Due more, Josiah suspected, to cocaine consumption than physical exertion. "He will no longer be living on my street. This sort, 10 or 15 years ago, would have hunted in one of the hills, Notting or Primrose, but now probably lived in some Pritzker laureate-designed lightbox where once stood a dust-blackened Victorian terrace. His blonde hair, darkened with age and silver at the temples, fluttered prettily in the late summer breeze. Josiah lit up fresh cigarettes, handing one to Doris. He remained as calm as the night air, smoking with one leg crossed over the other, rocking his foot. His audience unimpressed, the American turned away to follow the beggar. "What are you doing?" Josiah laughed. "That man has been living on my street for too long," he said, coming back, as if to the local neighborhood watch committee. "We've asked him kindly to move on, but he keeps on coming back. He's a nuisance, and it's time for him to go." Josiah tapped the ash from his cigarette as the American moved again to follow the beggar. "Do you know what you look like? Chasing a homeless man down the street with a hockey stick." The American spun round and raised his voice. "It's not a hockey stick. It's an antique, 36-inch ornamental Hurley. Can you imagine what would have happened if it was me doing what you're doing?" Josiah called after him as he left. "Only in London," Doris said with a headshake and a shoulder shrug as she took her phone back out. "Only in Hackney," said Josiah, exasperately. "Any luck?" "No. I guess I have to wait till Friday." "You sure you don't know anybody?" "I deleted all my numbers time ago," Josiah said. "I used to just pick up from one of the roadmen round my block, but I haven't smoked weed for time." "Honestly, do you think that homeless guy's going to be okay?" she sighed. "Surely that dude's not going to try and smash up his poxy hurling bat or whatever he said." "What's hurling anyway?" "I don't know," Josiah said, throwing back the last sip of his wine. "Want a top-up?" He didn't. "Oh, yeah, go on." The street had fallen oddly quiet. Only a 38 bus and an Uber passed. He thought he might hear shouts and screams if the American actually was attacking the beggar. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Auntie Lorraine, to their WhatsApp group. 3 years anniversary since my life and soul, my baby Kareem, was taken away from me. He had all his life ahead of him, and he was the sweetest, most loving son a mother could ever hope for. May he continue to rest in power always, and may God watch over all of you and keep you safe. She would have composed that message in notes, ready to send as the clock struck midnight. Kareem hadn't been in the fight, but his younger cousin was, and he'd stepped in, simple as. Josiah, who did not see the fight but was nearby, and an ambulance, arrived almost in an instant, but Kareem died in hospital of his injuries. Their last words to each other were lost in yelps of agony. They had grown up together, since primary school. Their mothers had been childhood friends, and perhaps now they were more like sisters, always in each other's backgrounds, as they went about their busy, daily lives, with full-time jobs, and as mothers, occasionally meeting for a Nando's or a Costa. Josiah and Kareem were only a month apart in age, both only children, and even looked like brothers. Neither knew their fathers, so it was one of those quiet running jokes, with the glint of possibility that they actually could have been. In any case, they were best friends. They had learned to smile the same way, found the same things funny, wore the same trainers, bookended the same star sign, played video games together round each other's flats, and football in Victoria Park. Josiah did better in exams, though Kareem didn't do badly, and started working as a barber after leaving school, while Josiah went to East London to study sports science. He remembered the police, all in their dark blue uniforms, hats on, crowding London fields that late summer evening very much like this one. You could feel the weight and force of a policeman's palm hit his chest, ordering him to go home. The boy who did it, and his people, had long gone, and those who were left surrounding the paramedics, themselves shit-scared about who else might still be carrying a knife, had to decide whether they would tell or not. An officer had phoned in the initial report into his radio, as if it was his 10th such knife-related incident of the day, and as if it was their job to simply sweep away the disruption rather than get to the bottom of a murder. "Non-white male," began his weary description of Kareem. What did that mean? Surely non-white could be anything. It was as if Kareem's identity had bled out into the ground beneath him, leaving him racially indeterminate, judgeable only against white. Josiah looked down at his hands, soaked in his best friend's red blood, already drying brown. He couldn't hear after that, as if his ear canals had swelled closed. He thought he might die too. He and Kareem would be like those twins who sympathize with each other's pain, one writhing in bed while her sister gives birth. The police busied themselves shouting at everyone to go home, threatening anyone who argued with arrest. It was days, weeks, before any statements were taken, by which time the truth took on fictional qualities, each viewpoint interpreted through growing malice. The boy who killed Kareem, a coke dealer's runner, got shanked to death himself, eventually, by someone else, over something else, and so the chain continued. Josiah ran home to tell his mother first. Then they walked together to break the news to Auntie Lorraine, who wailed and clutched her stomach as if Kareem wasn't already a big 20, as if he'd been snatched directly from her womb and slaughtered right there in her kitchen. 3 years. Kareem would still be cutting hair on Mayor Street. But now Josiah worked on the reception desk at a gym and was training part-time in physiotherapy, but still needed a second job as he was saving to buy a flat, though it felt as if he would have to work 24 hours a day for several hundred years before he might be able to afford a deposit, at least if he wanted to remain near his mum and her cooking. Doris came back with their glasses, sat down, gave Josiah his, and clinked. The American was back, apparently sober, dangling the gaudily painted stick down by his side. "Hey, what happened to the homeless man?" Doris asked him as 3 police cars approached behind. No sirens or lights, Josiah noted, as the cars parked right in front of them, turning the pavement into a stage. Doris and Josiah lit up another fag each and shuffled their bums on their stools, anticipating the adrenaline surge of an arrest. Several officers, minus their hats, got out of the cars and tucked their hands into their vests. A blonde one approached the American, who turned round to face them. "Sir," the officer mumbled flatly, "we've received a report that a man fitting your description has been seen wielding an offensive weapon with intent to cause harm. I'm afraid we're going to have to restrain you." The drunk, possibly coked-up, expensively bespectacled American, chasing an elderly beggar down Hackney Road with an ornamental wooden stick, plucked no doubt from a porcelain umbrella stand in his hallway, hadn't realized that somebody was watching him and calling the police, or that he would have drawn the attention of any number of neighbors crossing over to a bare window or inching open a Venetian blind to see what the commotion was so late on a Tuesday night. Perhaps they heard him shout, "He will no longer be living on my street." The officer crept round the back of the American, carefully retrieving the Hurley and passing it to a colleague, who stood admiring it in her hands. The blonde officer produced a set of cuffs and applied them to the American, who was compliant. The third officer was talking into his radio, walking away from the scene. Once he'd finished, Josiah got up and approached him. "So, I work here, in this restaurant, and me and my colleague were just sitting here having a glass of wine and a cigarette, as we usually do when we'd just finished work." The policeman thickened his neck and glared at Josiah. "And this homeless guy approached us to ask us if we had any change and—" "Yeah," the officer sneered. "Why don't you just go back inside?" Until Kareem's murder, Josiah had never had any trouble with the police in his life. Even during the worst times, when it was almost harder to sleep without the lullaby of sirens in the middle distance, or blue nightlights illuminated in his curtains, but he was still scared of them, and talking to them made his heart race. So despite his frustration, he obediently turned away to Doris. But I want to see what happens," she said, looking at him like a reprimanded child. "We'll look through the window," said Josiah. They went back into the restaurant, but left the door slightly open so they could hear, and Doris waved at one of the bartenders to turn the music down even further. While the police officers stood off him, the American said, "I'm under so much stress right now, and that man's not helping. What are you guys doing about him? I have to protect my family. Homelessness is a terrible problem, and I try to buy the big issue, but it's not something I personally want to deal with on my doorstep. I work really hard. I bring money into this neighborhood. You have to understand." Josiah thought about Eric Garner, selling individual cigarettes on a New York street, unarmed. "I can't breathe." Seething, Josiah told Doris, "If that was me, with the bat, drunk, coked up, and threatening to scull an elderly homeless man I was bored with, I'd be face down with a broken nose, dislocated shoulders, and cracked ribs, choking on my own blood." "But that would never happen," she said. "You would never do something like that." Because he wasn't that type of black guy. Like Rashawn Charles, perhaps, who recently died after a police arrest in this same borough. Verdict? Accidental death. Josiah was a good boy who lived with his mother, worked 2 jobs and eschewed drugs, and that was why he was still alive. Not that Kareem had been any different. He thought of the American's sheepish body language as he slowly walked back from his pursuit of the beggar, presumably bound for his precious lightbox. Did it occur to him at any point to run? If he made the decision to walk slowly, was it because he feared getting chased and maybe even shot? He wasn't wearing a hood. It would be clear from any angle or distance that he was a well-to-do white man. Josiah took out his phone and surreptitiously took a couple of photos, which came out blurred, because he was trembling as the American was told off, rather than cautioned, for possession of a weapon with intent to injure. At least that suggested the beggar had escaped unhurt. The American was nodding his head to whatever advice the officer who'd been speaking into his radio was giving. One of the officers drove away from the scene, and the blonde one released the American from his handcuffs. The duty manager came upstairs from his office and asked Josiah and Doris what was going on. With the rest of their colleagues, they all went out onto the street to smoke and watched the American, his antique hurling bat returned to him, walk away with his head down.
Hello, I'm Andrew O'Hagan. Thank you so much for listening to Esquire's summer fiction series in aid of UNICEF UK's Save Generation COVID appeal, which is supporting children and families impacted by coronavirus across the world. Please donate at www.unicef.org.uk/generationcovid. Thank you.